Live from the SABC's Auckland Park studios. Welcome to this week's last edition of the Watchdog. My name is Vuyo Mvoko, and on the show tonight, counting the costs of the Transnet strike. DA Chief Whip Siviwe Gwarube is going to table bills she says will fix coalition problems we've seen in municipalities. Is the official opposition trying to fix a problem it helped create? All that coming up in tonight's episode of The Watchdog, which starts right now. Siviwe Gwarube, the DA's chief whip in Parliament, is going to table a number of bills that are intended to fix coalition problems we've seen in the country's municipalities. She joins me now on the line from Cape Town. Siviwe, good evening. Thanks very much for your time. Perhaps take us through how you arrived at the decision to table bills. In other words, what is it that you are trying to deal with, that which can presumably can't be dealt with in any other way?
Good evening, Vuyo, and good evening to your viewers. Yes, I think South Africans, as they've been watching some of the events that have been unfolding across the country, have seen that not only is it starting this year, but as early as 2016, we started to see that, in fact, coalition governments are going to be a very permanent feature of our politics. And if anybody is looking at the research, and particularly some of the polling that many political parties are looking at, one can see that it is very feasible that the ANC may not be able to put together a 50% majority come 2024. And so looking at the events of the local governments, Vuyo, and the possibility that we may not have an outright majority from the current governing party, it is clear that South Africa's laws need to keep up with how our democracy is consolidating. And what is clear is that we may very well wake up on after election day in 2024 with a potential coalition government on our hands. And we've seen that some of these local governments have not been stable, and some of these coalition agreements have not held. And our fear is that if we have that, particularly at a national level, or even at a provincial level, that could wreak havoc. And ultimately, the biggest losers in all of these conflicts around coalition governments and coalition agreements are the citizens who are waiting on governments to deliver for them. And so we don't want to see that happening. And as the caucus, as the leader of the caucus in Parliament for the DA, it's important that we say to Parliament, how do we ready ourselves as a national legislature to make sure that we've got a legislative framework that will be able to put together stable coalition governments going forward?
But I mean, coalition governments, by their very nature, are things that need to be worked on. They require a great deal of maturity on the part of those who are a part of them, but also a very firm, solid, rational people, who keep in mind, the ultimate objective. In other words, whatever legislation you may put in place is no guarantee that you will get stability afterwards. The point I'm really making is that it takes a lot more than laws to make these coalitions work.
Absolutely, I agree with you. I couldn't agree with you more. However, Vuyo, at the moment, as you know, coalition agreements are put together by political parties who choose to do so, and political parties who are party to these agreements can choose choose to no longer be part of them. They don't have to necessarily have a reason that can be substantiated. They don't have to have a reason that is based on the coalition agreement. So by that I mean not all political parties that have pulled out of coalition agreements have done so on the basis that a coalition agreement has been broken. Some people, sometimes particularly smaller political parties where maybe people are kingmakers in councils, we have seen where they would swing on one way or another, which is fine and it's absolutely all right for them. But ultimately, the losers here will become the citizens of those municipalities, the residents of those municipalities. And ultimately, if we're looking at a national government, it becomes the citizens of South Africa. And so while, yes, legislation will not be the silver bullet, but ultimately, you've got to have a legal framework. Our democracy needs to, our laws in parliament need to catch up with how our democracy is evolving. And so that's why we're saying, how do we make sure that we simply take away the notion that coalition agreements are simply a gentleman's agreement that is made behind closed doors that citizens cannot hold us accountable to? And that's why one of the proposals that we make, we think are really, really key, is borrowed from the Kenyan model. As you know, that they've been grappling with issues around coalition governments for quite some time, and they passed a law in 2007 in which it states that in the event that there is a coalition government in place, it has established what they call a political registrar. Now, what that political registrar is an independent sort of custodian and secretariat of the coalition agreement, which in our view is very key, because ultimately, right now, it is up to individuals and individual political leaders to not only negotiate, but also it is their responsibility to keep those coalition agreements together. And as you've said, people simply, there's a lot that's needed, maturity, temperament and the like. But if you've got a legal framework that at least says, we've got a registrar that looks after this coalition agreement. If you're a party to this coalition agreement, there's an independent, non-political registrar that says, these are the political parties that have agreed to be part of this coalition agreement on the basis of these principles, on the basis of these priorities. If a political party wishes to pull out of that coalition agreement, they have to do so in writing, not to any other political party, but to the registrar whose responsibility it is to publicize some of those agreements to the citizens of South Africa. And so then the cost of pulling out becomes rather high, because you've got to explain to your voters, why is it that you have now been you have been responsible for collapsing a government that in fact may have been delivering for them. And so I think that it really takes the sting of politicization of these coalition agreements out of maintaining them when you've got an independent and often rational entity that is looking after at least the maintenance of those coalition agreements. And as you know, Vuyo, straight after elections, people are still licking their wounds. There are hotheads, and even the laws currently only give councils, legislatures, only 14 days to formulate a government. That's also one of the proposals that we make in some of the pieces of legislation.
Let me just pause in, for a second. We are going to, because this is the point of this interview, what you are putting really on the table. But before we get there, I just want to go back to one or two issues that that you raised in this last answer, because one of the problems, yes, you're correct. A big part of the problem, there's two councillors who may be, kingmakers. You have one a councillor who suddenly can swing things, either way, and it really isn't fair looked at objectively. But there is also the problem that your party is or has been accused of, which is how you have managed these coalitions. You may have seen over the past a couple of weeks, several of your coalition partners coming on this program, and of course, and other programs as well. But talking about how you have managed these coalitions as the Democratic Alliance, this big brother, big sister, some went further to even say arrogant attitude that you have displayed, disrespect towards partners who are actually keen, very keen to work with you, notwithstanding the differences that they may have. In other words, the emphasis has been on how you have managed these coalitions, especially in the metros. In other words, you don't have similar problems elsewhere where there are coalitions. You have IFP and ANC in other areas in coalition-like arrangements that are not as fractious as we have seen in Johannesburg and Nelson Mandela Bay, and now we're talking about Ekurhuleni as well.
Look, fair enough. And you raised the point about how political parties have come on to say, these have been badly managed. But this is part of what we are saying needs to change. Because, of course, currently what is happening is that the party with the most amount of votes in any council is the de facto custodian of that coalition agreement. So they've got partners, but ultimately you are leading the coalition government, and there are certain things that you've got to make sure that you keep in place so that the coalition government can stay together. But what we're saying is that if you take that out of the equation, then this is not then a matter of perception. Whether or not a political party is suitable to be part of that government is not a matter of perception, whether somebody feels that you're being arrogant or somebody feels that you are pushing them around. Then it becomes an objectively legislated thing where it's about an independent entity that helps to manage the coalition governments. You can't deny the fact that because these coalition governments are created and often out of multiple parties. In fact, the metro governments that you've listed, one of the key common factors is that there's more than just two political parties that are part of those coalition governments. In some instances, you've got 10-party coalition governments that by nature is going to be incredibly difficult to manage. And so what we're saying is that if we see that scenario playing itself out in the future, you've got to stop having political parties you've got to, obviously, politicians must negotiate because that's the job of what politics is about. But ultimately, the management of that coalition agreement, the administering of that coalition agreement, the onboarding of South African citizens on that coalition agreement needs to be independently managed. Then you don't get political parties that are saying, well, we're dealing with an arrogant political party. Then they have to say, these are some of the things in the coalition agreement which have been broken, which is an objective standard by which you are judged. And that's why I'm saying that some of these things are about strengthening and creating a legislative framework that doesn't exist as it stands. And these things are subject to simply politicians meeting behind closed doors. Some political parties don't even make their coalition agreements and some of the terms to which they are agreed public. We decided to do so right at the beginning of these governments in 2021. But ultimately, you've got to take the sting of having a custodian of a coalition agreement out of the hands of politicians and into an independent entity. And we've seen it work in other countries, and there is international best practice around this.
But are you prepared as a party? This hasn't come through. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but are you prepared as a party to at least acknowledge that marches, you may have big numbers in coalition arrangements. There are concessions that you have to allow, but also the acknowledgements that you need to make that no matter how small your coalition partners may be, all right, you have to acknowledge that they are what they give you the numbers you need to then be able to govern and make a difference in people's lives. Because that's where it starts. And that seems to be the biggest problem that your partners, now former, seem to have.
No, absolutely. There's a complete acknowledgement of that. And I think, I think as the DA, we probably have the most amount of experience in running coalition governments since the days of 2006 in the city of Cape Town. So there's absolutely acknowledgement that there are concessions that have to be made. But I think you can appreciate, Vuyo, that these are difficult to manage when there are 10 different political parties around the table that have 10 different interests that are now, what you have to do is corral people around one common set of goals. And remember, people's goals and people's motivations changed as political winds changed themselves. And so there's concessions that have to be made. I mean, if you look at the situation that happened in Johannesburg, when our coalition partners came around the decision-making table and they said, look, your speaker's been voted out, we think you should consider putting forward a different speaker. And the DA had to come back and say, while the decision of who we field in these positions remains with that political party, because of course no political party can tell you who you must send in those positions. All that you are told is that you get a speaker position, you get 3 MMC positions. But in that instance, the DA was able to say, look, of course, we have to, because in the interest of the citizens of Johannesburg, a concession has to be made. A different speaker was put to the fore. And then a matter was brought on where people were saying, well, actually, maybe you shouldn't keep the speaker position. Now, as you can imagine, this can continue to go on and on and on until actually it's quite untenable. And that is why I will end where I began with this, that coalition governments cannot collapse on the basis of perceptions, but they have to either end or begin on the basis of common set of goals and a common set of principles that are set and codified and formalized. And if you break them, then you're out of the coalition agreement. And citizens can judge you harshly for having broken an agreement that you agreed to.
But why don't you first deal with these problems, real or perceived, right? Why don't you perhaps go out of your way to fix the problems that have been identified, right, in the coalition arrangements that you've already had, before perhaps going for these bills that you are proposing, which we're going to get into next. Why don't you at least make an effort, or at least be seen to be making an effort that says, let's see if we can't find one another with Action SA in Johannesburg, or the Patriotic Alliance or whoever. In other words, demonstrate your willingness to actually deal with the problems. And only once you've given up, you say, well, it's not working, do you then move to tampering with the laws?
I disagree with you entirely. I don't think that those two processes need to be mutually exclusive. I think that there is work underway by the DA leadership in various provinces and the various regions to reach out to coalition partners that are currently existing and former coalition partners to mend bridges, to find each other, as you say. But Vuyo, again, we've got to, this is not, the laws that are proposed here are not to deal with a DA problem. The laws that are proposed here are to deal with a legislative gap for South Africa. This is not about dealing with the DA's problem of saying we are trying to make sure that the coalition governments are stable in the now. Whether or not we're able to salvage some of these coalition governments will remain a matter of time, as we're going to see next week, whether the court upholds our challenge to the illegal the illegal council meeting. All of those things can happen at the same time. But I think you've got to understand that the motivation to establish legal frameworks is something that has to happen, whether or not the DA is in opposition or in government in some of these metros. It's not about local government either. It's a South African reality. And so if nobody in Parliament in particular, where our legislators sit, is thinking about the fact that there needs to be a way in which we mend our democracy, or at least we bring our laws up to speed with how our democracy is unfolding, we're going to sit with a big problem on our hands in years to come when we're looking at hung legislators, when we are looking at possibly a hung National Assembly. So agreed, there has to be work that must be done to reach out across the aisle and find each other, not just because you've got to find it because of the goodness of your heart. For the citizens of those metros that entrusted a multi-party government to lead them and lead service delivery, we've got to find each other, and that work is ongoing. But this is equally important. In fact, one may argue that if we don't have a legislative framework, then even that work can be threatened and undone in the future.
Well, the other option is to put work or perhaps a lot more effort in growing the party so that you get the requisite maturity wherever you want to govern. And then you're not going to need anyone to help you get the numbers you need to be able to govern.
Sure, I think every political party walks into an election with the desire to want to govern outright. But ultimately, the reality is that, as I said, coalition governments are becoming a very permanent feature of our politics. And the mere fact that, Vuyo, there are countries like Germany, like Denmark, like Kenya, for instance, on the continent closer to home, countries around the world have already been grappling with issues of coalition governments. It does not make it a unique South African issue. It also is part of a consolidating and a growing democracy. We must accept that perhaps the time for dominant party politics is over, and that now is the time where citizens are saying, we would rather have multi-parties governing so that they can perform checks and balances on each other. Whatever the motivations of voters are, it is our job to be responsive to those needs and to show up. And so ultimately, yes, we are going into 2024 hoping to bring the ANC way below 50% and also govern in perhaps more than one other province. That has to be the goal, but it may not always materialize. And so you can't then say, look, let's rather than hold off on this and see if we grow, because again, I want to emphasize, this is not about a DA issue. This is a South African issue. And for me, as a chief whip of the official opposition in Parliament, it is my duty to ring the bell, the alarm bells now already in Parliament to say we don't have legislation to deal with these kind of setups in government. We don't want to sit with a situation like the Electoral Amendment Bill, which is now, has a Concord deadline, which the National Assembly is unlikely to meet. We can't have that. And because, ultimately it's Parliament's job to pass laws. And so we've got to get on with the business.
Okay, you've spoken about setting up, or one of the key features which you've brought from Kenya, setting up an independent registrar of political parties. I'm particularly interested in two other features, one of which is setting an electoral threshold. Why is that important, and how do you envisage that working?
Look, if you study across all coalition governments that have been successful somewhat and rather stable, you realize also one of the common features of those coalition governments across the globe is that there have been electoral thresholds that have been put in place. By that we mean if you obtain a certain amount of seats, then that gets you into a council, that gets you into a legislature, that gets you in Parliament. The reason why that is important is because what you don't want is an over-fragmentation of politics to the point where you've got a 20-party coalition government at a national level, and keeping that together becomes an almost impossible task. Because again, ultimately, Vuyo, we've got to also make some concessions here to understand that maybe for the sake of stability, we've also got to make a trade-off with saying that, well, if you are unable to put together 1% of the national vote, then you can't be part of this coalition government because we need sizable numbers so that we can manage a coalition in a stable manner.
Isn't this a big problem a problem of big parties, big established parties, that once you are in and you've grown, you want to push out or to make it difficult for small growing parties to come in? And this has also been a criticism leveled at these amendments to the Electoral Act, that the big parties are blocking the new, those small and new, by creating these barriers to entry, and which people have said is hypocrisy on the part of big parties.
Look, I don't think it's hypocrisy. Firstly, I think let's go back to first principles. If you look at what the Constitution says about proportional representation, it speaks about the fact that with every election, there has to be an effort to recognize general proportional representation. And so if you look at that, you realize that even the drafters of the Constitution, Vuyo, understood that there was never a scenario where in a proportional representation system, you are ever going to get 100% representation. And so if you're able to put together 1% of the vote, either in a metro, and get seats in a council, then ultimately that buys you a seat at the door. And enough people have in fact entrusted you and entrusted your brand to vote for you to be part of that coalition government. And ultimately, as I said, it's a trade-off that we have to make. Because if you study coalition governments by nature, very few of them that are stable don't have electoral thresholds. But we've been very cautious to not simply say, look, we would rather prefer 5%, of course, because as the DA, we're, 20%, 21% support political party. So it would be easy, to be able to say, well, if you can't put together 5% of the national vote, then you shouldn't enjoy representation. But what we are saying is that, look, we are putting proposals together with international best practice that is in here to go and engage our political parties, not only the people who we have partnered up with in some of these governments, but all the political parties that are represented in Parliament. As I speak to you this evening, I've engaged every single chief whip in the National Assembly about our proposal to say that how do we, whether you're from the ANC or the ATM or Al Jamaa, how do we make sure that political parties that are here in Parliament can actually do the job that they've been entrusted to do, should we find ourselves in a scenario where we have to put together a national coalition government? And so these are not set in stone. And if you read the document, it says we are looking at what has worked in countries where coalition governments have worked, and we are saying, here are the proposals. Let's engage, because we want to put together a piece of legislation that will work. There'll always be trade-offs, Vuyo, that we have to admit. There's going to be trade-offs. We're not going to get 100% of everything that we want, including a 0.5% representation of a political party and a stable government. Certain trade-offs have to be made as long as they're in line with the Constitution and actually they serve the citizens of South Africa.
Let's end it on another proposal very briefly that you are making, and that is to extend a time period for election of mayors, because then again, I'm going to go back to where I started when I asked you a lot of questions about how you manage these coalitions, but also whether you're not trying to fix problems that you've actually helped create as a party in how you've managed these things. Because I mean, a proposal to extend, that you believe that the time allowed for president, premiers, and mayors to be elected should possibly be extended from the current 14 days from the declaration of the election result. And you're saying this is to give parties sufficient time to negotiate functional, binding coalition agreements. And I remember it takes me back to conversations we're having with all political leaders in the run-up to and immediately after elections. In other words, all of you seem to go into an election ill-prepared, in fact, not prepared at all in many instances for these eventualities. And then you start clutching at straws when the voters once the voters have spoken. Whereas in other jurisdictions, people go into an election knowing very well or having prepared for whatever scenario. In other words, if the scenario A, this is what we would do. And then you can talk about whatever principles that you're not going to compromise on. In other words, you do all of this beforehand, before you even go to an election, so that you're not caught by surprise, and then you start figuring out what to do once the voters have spoken.
I think you raised two very important things there, Vuyo. The one is, look, I don't know how other political parties work, but I know for a fact that there's a lot of prep work that goes before an election, the Democratic Alliance. In fact, Project 2024 has already been started, or is already ongoing as prep work. But also you mentioned an important thing, which is that ultimately elections we can plan to infinity. But ultimately, it's the voters who decide whether they'll give us 30% or 35% of the vote. And then at that point, it's only then, once the chips are in and the votes are counted and certified, that now you think, all right, well, who is it that we can potentially work with? These are our non-negotiables and the like. And our view is just simply a practical one. For instance, I make an example of Germany. It took them months to put together a coalition government. And 14 days is not enough, because what then it does, it incentivizes political parties to simply just rush the process, get in people where they're not entirely in agreement about certain priorities or principles, and then ultimately it destabilizes the government in months to come, where somebody pulls out and simply says, well, I'm no longer part of this. So our view is that this should be uniform. It should be at least starting from 30 days. And that's something that is in the Constitution that we are proposing should change. Because if coalitions are going to be the future of our politics, then we've also got to make provision for the fact that we may be sitting together with 7, 8 political parties and having to negotiate where are we going to go, what are our priorities, what are our non-negotiables. And we've also got to give this registrar, assuming that our proposals are taken on board and are in the legislation, we've also got to give this political independent registrar enough opportunity to put together a binding document that is publicized for South Africans to see. So it's more of a logistical issue that we think it just makes sense.
That's where we're going to leave it. Thanks very much for your time this evening. Viyo Gwarube, who is the DA's chief whip in Parliament. She intends to introduce 3 separate private members' bills that she and her party hope will go a long way towards dealing with the coalition problems we've seen across municipalities, especially in metros. After the break, counting the costs of the Transnet strike. Don't go away. Welcome back. Transnet CEO Portia Debbie says the strike action is hampering business activity. Debbie says the company is engaging with all the affected parties. The company says the strike action has forced the entity to start working on how to recover from the industrial action. Thousands of Transnet workers have downed tools over higher wages.
It's been over 8 days since the over 40,000 Transnet workers downed tools. Despite the ongoing wage negotiations under the watch of the CCMA, the industrial action has been intensified.
We are called by CCMA commissioners. They have given us their proposals that we need to share with our members. We have taken those proposals and discussed it with our members. We are still waiting for our members to give us a mandate. We are resolute as SATAU and its members that up until such time workers' demand has been met, we will continue with our strike. We are mindful of the fact that the economy is bleeding, and we are calling on the employer to consider the workers' demand to stop in order to stop the ailing economy to suffer.
Transnet says the strike has impacted waterside and landside operations at its Durban port, which handles 65% of South Africa's container volumes. CEO Portia Derby says they are already positioning themselves for damage control as the operations have been affected.
What we've done is that we tie up the planning a lot closer with the industry. For example, unfortunately now the deciduous and berry season was starting week 41 in the Western Cape in Cape Town, and we had planned and were ready to make sure that we met all of the deliveries, and we had actually no omissions by vessels. Unfortunately, the strike puts us on a bad footing, but we've also started planning around how we would ensure recovery.
The Durban Chamber of Commerce President Prashin Maharaj says its business members are counting losses from the strike almost daily. The chamber estimates that the strike could cost the country more than 12 billion rands if it is prolonged. Operations at two of KwaZulu-Natal's ports in Durban and Richards Bay have been severely affected. The Durban Chamber of Commerce is worried about the financial impact of the strike.
Well, our main concern is that when one looks at the last strike in 2010 of this nature, it cost the economy 7 billion rand. Our estimates, this will cost the economy between 12 and 15 billion rand, which is a billion rand a day. And this is a cost our fragile economy can ill afford. And we are concerned that there will be further job losses and further suppression and depression of our already fragile economy.
The government is encouraging the parties to resolve the deadlock in the best interest of the country's economy. This week, 3 cabinet ministers joined the wage talks to facilitate a speedy resolution.
So the negotiations is between parties. What government has been doing in terms of the Minister of Labour, Public Enterprises and myself has been to try to understand on both parties where are the stick points, also to listen to management, to listen to as well as industry. And what we have done, having listened to all parties, has really been to encourage and urge them to go back to the negotiation table and actually resolve this matter because of its impact to the economy as a whole.
There is hope that the strike will be lifted soon, as such mass action also turns to impact investor confidence.
SABC News, Pretoria.
The ongoing Transnet strike will likely have a material impact on the work of SARS. That's according to Commissioner Edward Kisweta. Imports and exports have largely come to a halt, reducing the tax agency's revenues. The Commissioner was speaking at celebrations of SARS' 25th anniversary. The agency has collected trillions of rands over years, enabling government to spend on imperatives like education, health, social security, and infrastructure.
Cutting a cake in celebration of an institution that's been integral in helping to fund South Africa's developmental programs. Over the past 25 years, SARS has collected over 18 trillion rand, which includes the 1.64 trillion rand collected in the year ended March 2022. President Cyril Ramaphosa said the men and women of SARS were not just about collecting rands and cents, but about pursuing a higher purpose to transform the economy for the benefit of all.
Beyond its revenue and compliance mandate, SARS was created to have a transformative impact. It had to transform this country because we needed the resources to transform the country.
The president spoke highly of SARS in helping to ensure that the government was able to assist households and businesses during COVID-19, for example. He lamented how the agency went backwards during the years of state capture and emphasized that his government would continue to support it as it works to restore itself to its former glory.
We saw an unfortunate decline in revenue performance in the years 2014 to 2018. It became clear to us that this important institution, this very valuable institution of our democracy, had been repurposed to serve the interests of corrupt and politically connected people.
SARS Commissioner Edward Kisweta says the tax agency is making good strides as it invests in technology and its people in its bid to collect more revenue and improve tax compliance. But short-term difficulties like the Transnet strike put a temporary spanner in the works.
A strike at Transnet will have material impact on the efficiency of our ports, which are already struggling with inefficiencies and already have infrastructure capacity and capability challenges.
President Ramaphosa held SARS up as a good example of a public institution that is able to work with excellence, adding that state departments and other public entities would do well to emulate its practices in a move to create a more capable state. Nampumelelo Siziba, SABC News, Pretoria.
For more on the Transnet strike, we are now joined by two unions that are involved. Rifta Ajam is the General Secretary of FEDUSA, Labour Federation. We're also joined by the First Deputy President of SATAU, Nkoketse Sipohwane. Good evening to both of you. Thank you very much for your time. Perhaps let's start with the latest. Where are things as we stand right now, Nkoketse?
Good evening to you, Vuyo, and your viewers. Look, the commissioners that were mandated by the Department of Labour through the CMA to come and do conciliation have actually given us a recommended offer of about 6% across the board for the first year, 5.5% for the second year, and 6% for the year after this one, meaning they have recommended a multi-year agreement for the purposes of stability. Currently, what is happening is that we are getting mandate from our members about the offer. So there's meetings that are happening. We're going to get the full feedback tomorrow morning when we meet there with our structures, as that they will be represented by provincial office bearers from all the 9 provinces in terms of what mandate they're giving around the new revised offer and remandating us as their leadership.
Rifta, is that pretty much what is happening with regard to your unions as well? Please unmute.
My apologies. Good evening, Vuyo, and good evening to the viewers. Indeed, that is the analysis at this stage, but only just recommendations coming from the CCMA at this juncture. The mandating process is underway, but what I would like to emphasize currently, as we wait for those mandates to come through from the members, is the fact that unions are always remaining cautious in light of what has happened from past experience with concluding those multi-term agreements, and on the backlash of what has happened in the public sector with regards to Resolution 1 of 2018 and not being able to meet those commitments on the tail end of implementation of those agreements. The trust deficit, once again, is something that we cannot ignore. We've seen it in the public sector. We've seen it with PRASA once again, and with this current multi-term agreement, the proposal thereof, it is something that we are waiting for with bated breath to determine whether or not it may or may not be feasible, on the back of pleading poverty when the notion of stability is mooted, but in essence, instability is created as a result of the trust deficit that arises as a result of that non-implementation.
Is that your sense, Rifta, that these parastatals and government plead poverty where there is none?
Well, it's absolutely unfortunate that experience is our teacher at this stage now, and we cannot ignore the fact that there are many dimensions to this discussions. We are equally looking forward to stability, and we want to ensure that we unlock the potential and that we demonstrate with absolution the competence that resides within many of these enterprises, in particular at Transnet, where you have the engineering skills in particular in the harbours, in the ports, that are key enablers to key policies that government has implemented, such as the NDP as well as the Economic Reconstruction and Recovery Plan. But unfortunately, when you fail to implement, it leaves a bitter taste, not only in the mouths of workers, but investors too, because we certainly do have the competence. I want to emphasize that that. And what we want to avert at this stage is a brain drain, because South Africa is completely attractive to the likes of the UAE. So at this stage, wherever we can, we must certainly want to avert that. But I emphasize once again that history has taught us those ugly lessons.
Nkoketsi, I mean, interesting what Rifta has just said about expertise, she says, reside with the people who work at these parastatals. She also talks about efficiencies. I'm saying interesting in the sense that, I mean, from the package we just played, you had the Commissioner of SARS, Edward Kisweta, talking about inefficiencies and how this strike, he says, is going to exacerbate those and pull these, Transnet back.
For your look, the inefficiencies have always been existing due to the inability of the Transnet board and the Transnet management to deal with these inefficiencies. I mean, these inefficiencies predate even the arrival of the current CEO and the current board. But it is born of the instability that Transnet has suffered. I mean, Transnet has seen in the previous just 3 or 4 years, it has seen 2 acting CEs and one CE that is appointed, a group CE that is appointed. So there's been a lot of activity that also creates instability. But back to what we are discussing here, which is the strike. Look, Vuyo, Transnet workers have been braving COVID-19 and braving all these other risks that were attributed to COVID-19 when even the risks themselves were uncalculated. And these workers braved COVID-19 to come and drive the South African economy because they are sensitive to the economy and they know the impact that their non-action will have towards the South African economy. It can't be that today when they are fighting for their rights through their bargaining the right to strike, they are seen to be people that are going to be crippling the economy. The effects of the strike were known to all even before it started. And this strike is not a natural disaster. This strike is happening on the basis that the employer is arrogant, the employer is not negotiating in good faith, the employer is engaged in Chinese bargaining, the employer is moving 1% per day. I mean, we started at 0% with the employer in around July. We moved to a 1%, from a 1% to a 1.5, from a 1.5 to a 2.5, from a 2.5 to a 3, up until then the CCMA came through conciliation. But already by then, you must take note that we're already on the streets. Inclusions of the 3 ministers that came, they already came when the strike was in effect. It's not that they came before the strike to try and avert the strike. So they are actually trying to extinguish what already started. But as SATAW, we had written to the Minister of Public Enterprise, Pravin Gordhan, we had written to the President of the Republic, and we keep on saying this every time we appear on media. Early in the days where we saw that the employers engaged in Chinese bargaining, to say, look, there's a strike that might emerge out of this type of negotiations. And we must say that this type of negotiation style that the employers engage on is foreign to Transnet, because previously this is not how we used to engage on wages. I mean, Transnet has not had a strike for the past 12 years. It's only now that we're having a strike. But above and beyond that, Vuyo, what we want to raise to the South African community is that internally, there's management inefficiencies. I'll tell you now that the reason why workers are forcing the employer to give them their current demand, which is currently a double digit, up until we will be properly mandated tomorrow in relation to the new recommendation by the conciliators. Transnet has got duplication of managers internally, and we are forced to say this because we are seen to be people that are unreasonable. You will find that there's 2 GMs doing the same thing, and they are being paid at 2.2 million each. So the company is top heavy on the basis that there's duplication. The company is top heavy on the basis that even now, with currently when they are saying they can't afford the current wage demand that workers are having, they continue to advertise executive positions that are going to cost the company 2.2 per person annually. So this shows that the financial reckless decisions that the employer is taking in terms of hiring people and not absorbing from inside. Because remember, when you absorb inside, you're not necessarily increasing the salary budget with bigger margins, because you'll be promoting from internal and using skills that has been there internal for the longest of time. And again, you must also note that the issue of us saying we demand more is because these executives are also saying this year they're going to pay themselves 3% as a wage increase on top of the 8.6, the 5.9, 5.4 respectively that they took as the executive of group and including the operating divisions. So there is money. It's just unfortunate that this money, it does not suit the junior officials because we don't know what sin they've committed against this management, including the Transnet board.
Now, Rifta, I mean, we from that earlier package, I mean, it noted the fact that 3 cabinet ministers have joined the wage talks with the hope of facilitating a speedy resolution. We saw Minister Togo Didiza speaking there. Have they made a difference, or has their arrival made any difference this week?
We are very interesting question indeed, but please allow me just to demystify that issue that you've identified earlier on with regards to inefficiencies and efficiencies. When we talk about the inefficiencies, we cannot ignore the fact that the executive as well as the board need to be able to be strategic in terms of the decision-making processes and the guidance that they are giving at the end of the day. What is important that Keketso outlines as well is, number one, red tape bedevils this process. Number 2, the fact that approvals are taking them 3 to 6 months to exercise is absolutely ridiculous, because that is in essence where management, as alluded to, is not able to live up to the expectations, and that is where we are in fact losing out on what needs to happen. So when we talk about our ability to be competitive because of our geographic location, one can only go back and ask management to take introspect and take a blame for what has been happening here, and not necessarily cause a diversion in this matter here. Hence the reason I say efficiencies are there in terms of the technical competence. Vuyo, in terms of the actual question that has been fielded, the ministers have been there. We appreciate the political will and we appreciate the commitment to try and get this process moving forward. But you cannot come to a negotiation table purely for the sake of listening without coming to bring concrete recommendations and even proposals for solutions to go beyond this impasse that we have at this stage. And I want to completely support the notion of this Chinese negotiations that are going on here now, because if we can just go one step back, these negotiations were supposed to have been concluded by April already, when this process should have started in November last year. The employer only came to the table at the end of May this year. So why is there a delay? Why cause further agony to a process when we know that we are reaching the festive season? The cranes are up in the harbour. We can ill afford this. This is the time when we need to be able to demonstrate to the world the capabilities that we have. So unfortunately, without doing justice to both sides of the coin, I think that management equally needs to take introspect for some of the failures that they have contributed to this very process. So there have been delays, unnecessary delays that could have been averted completely in terms of this process. And we cannot ignore the fact that workers have just come out of a pandemic. So we cannot be looking at a situation where wage insecurity continues to engulf this particular process and expect workers to take below inflationary rated increases.
Nkoketse, very briefly, we have run out of time. I mean, Rifta was talking about the fact that we are all coming out of a pandemic. And I was listening earlier to the president of the Durban Chamber of Commerce pointing out that the last strike of this nature in 2010 cost the economy 7 billion rands, and he estimates that this one will cost in the region of 12 to 15 billion rands. How much of a factor is that for the workers as well? I mean,
look, Vuyo, the workers, if they are not going to be given this increase, are directly or indirectly being excluded from being economical players. So currently, like we're saying, those workers are sensitive to the economy because these workers live in the very same, we've got workers that live in the same vicinity that the Durban Chamber of Commerce is representing, that are also are suffering the same fate that this business Chamber of Commerce is alluding to. This 12 billion loss will also affect them. So workers are out there to just get a living wage that will buffer them from the current inflation that is imposed by obviously the pandemic, but also inefficiencies internally, both of government and that of Transnet. Because while there is no infrastructure investment that is government has brought to Transnet to try and assist Transnet to deal with these inefficiencies that are being experienced by the ports, by the ports. And on top of that, government is also happy with the narrative that says these ports are being divorced by big shipping liners that are rerouting their traffic somewhere else. Although workers internally have been saying, we need new cranes, we need new equipment, we need new tools of the trade so that we can improve our turnaround times when they were at the plant. But now that they are on the streets, they are made to be people that don't care about the economy and don't care about the company or disregarding the losses that capital will incur when they are on strike. But we must remember that the right to strike was fought for, there was blood spilled, our forefathers fought for this right, and we must exercise it without prejudice. And this is exactly what we're doing. We're not doing anything illegal, we're doing what is within our human rights, that is enshrined both in the Constitution of the Republic and the Labour Relations Act. And we're cautious of the economy. But the employer must come back to the table and negotiate with us. Thanks for you.
Spokwane and Rifta Ajam, thanks to both of you for availing yourself. We have been trying, of course, for the whole week to get Transnet to come on and put their side of the story and respond directly to some of the accusations and allegations being leveled at them. But unfortunately, without much success. The door, of course, is still open. But that's our show for tonight and for this week. To join us again on Monday. Have a great weekend.